Wow, hello. You're a very disciplined audience. I love how a hush just fell over the audience. Warm welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this discussion about whether we can still head off a nuclear arms race. It's fantastic to see so many of you here today. I'm Marion Messmer. I'm a senior research fellow in the International Security Program here at Chatham House, and I'm going to be your chair for tonight's event. I assume you all are very aware of the various ways in which the nuclear environment has unfortunately slowly deteriorated over the last few years. We've seen an acceleration of aggressive nuclear rhetoric and various challenges to the global nuclear order, which is something that has been on everyone's minds since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. But it's also something that unfortunately has been apparent much before that point in time. But it's a dynamic that has sort of increased in pace as well as in intensity over the last several years. So today's event will give us an opportunity to talk about whether we can still head off a new arms race, how we can react to some of the many challenges that different components of the global nuclear order are facing today. And I'm really pleased that we have three fantastic speakers with us tonight. We have, and I will introduce them all now, and then they will give their remarks in turn. So we will start tonight with Rose Gottemoeller, who is, of course, the former Deputy General of NATO, and she's joining us online today. All of our speakers are incredibly accomplished and have really, really long biographies that I'm not going to read out in full, but if you want to find out more about them, then you can find their full biographies on our events website. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Jamie Kwong, who is a fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but luckily able to join us here in London. And then finally, our third speaker is going to be Dr. Patricia Lewis, who's our own research director in the International Security Program at Chatham House. So we will hear from each of our speakers briefly, and then I will ask a few questions just so that you can prepare any questions that you might have for our speakers. And so if you are in the room with us, if you want to ask a question, once I open the floor for questions, please just raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. When you do ask your question, please introduce yourself, just briefly state your name and state the organization that you are representing, if you are representing any organization. And if you are joining us online, then I've got a laptop right next to me, and I'll keep an eye on any questions that are coming in that way, and you'll get to ask your question whether it's in the room or online. So with that, that's all I really have to say to all of you, and I'll turn the floor over to Rose, who's going to kick us off.
Oh, thank you so very much, Marion, and thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you today online. I would much rather have been in the room, and I know many friends and colleagues are there today. So my greetings from California. I apologize, our lawn team is here, and so you will hear some noise of lawnmowers in the background. It is still growing season here in California, and Monday morning is their day to be here, but they will be finished very shortly, so I apologize for that. What I wanted to say to begin with, many of you know that I served on the Strategic Posture Commission of the United States, a bipartisan group that completed its work 1 year ago in October of 2023. And we did conclude that we may very well need to increase in numbers or change the structure of our strategic nuclear triad in order to address the threats emanating from the Russian Federation, well known and understood, but also now the new modernization of the Chinese People's Republic, where they are building up their nuclear warhead numbers, we fear, to as many as 1,500 warheads by 2035, according to the Department of Defense. So it is in that context that the Strategic Posture Commission saw a very serious challenge ahead for the United States and our strategic nuclear deterrence. But we also emphasize the necessity of continuing to look for opportunities to control nuclear weapons and also to avoid proliferation of nuclear weapons. In that regard, I also want to point to a conclusion that I outlined in a Financial Times opinion piece back on September 5th of this year. That is that the Strategic Posture Commission was very clear that we should not in any way reopen the program of record that was agreed by President Obama back in 2016 to modernize the current triad of strategic nuclear forces. The key point about that modernization program is that it is to replace the current triad, to replace it, but not to increase it. And indeed, the modernization is and was to take place under the limits of the New START Treaty, 1,550 deployed warheads and 700 delivery vehicles. Although Vladimir Putin has seized implementation measures under the treaty, Russia continues to abide by those limits, and the United States is abiding by those limits as well. And I believe both countries should continue to abide by those limits as modernization unfolds. As long as Russia does not begin building up, the United States should not build up, and vice versa. That means the program of record can continue to unfold as intended without reopening it to impose new requirements on it, because the program of record is so tightly scheduled that if it is piled with new requirements, then it is liable to stall and perhaps even to fail. And so that means that we have a window of opportunity to continue to work on trying to get back to the negotiating table, both the negotiating table with the Russian Federation and with China. The program of record will only be completed in the 2035 to 2045 time period, and therefore we have some time to work on starting new negotiations. So I like to put that point out as a tiny bit of optimism in an otherwise quite dark environment, but I do think it's worth discussing and bearing in mind that we don't need to panic. We have time to work this problem. And with that, I will turn off my audio so you don't need to listen to the lawnmowers anymore. They should be finished very, very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose. Over to you, Jamie.
Great. So that's a very helpful set of remarks, Rose, and it's great to see you again. I wanted to talk specifically about three key challenges that I think is facing the non-proliferation regime in particular. So picking up on Rose's point about preventing future proliferation. So let me walk you through the three, and then hopefully we'll get into some policy options of what we can do about it. So first and foremost, I think the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the broader non-proliferation regime that it really props up is under significant stress. So there's some very real frustration by non-nuclear weapon states on the lack of disarmament progress by the P5, those nuclear states recognized by the NPT. Essentially this concern that the P5 have failed to uphold their end of the grand bargain that's really at the heart of the treaty. Moreover, we've seen TPNW, Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We've seen states in that forum really challenge the concept of deterrence itself, really interrogating the value of the security value of nuclear weapons. And so we've seen these stark divisions really play out in international forums, most especially, at the NPT review cycle meetings. And I think that these divisions could prove increasingly untenable and are likely to only get worse if we do see the world kind of unfold into a full-fledged nuclear arms race. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two, I think we're seeing a fraying non-proliferation consensus. So traditionally among the P5, but in particular the US and Russia, there's been a broad recognition that non-proliferation is in their interests, right? Not only does it cement their primacy as nuclear powers, a status symbol, if you will, but it also helps enhance their security. Fewer nuclear states means fewer nuclear threats. It also avoids the problem of having smaller nuclear armed allies getting involved in a conflict that could escalate to all-out nuclear war. But today we're really seeing a fraying of this consensus, right? Historically, we've seen the US and Russia in particular, or the Soviet Union, really seeing this common interest as a way to work on collaborative non-proliferation efforts, including the negotiation of the NPT. But now we see Russia in particular prioritizing its diverging short-term interests, right? We see Russia blocking Iran and North Korea in the UN Security Council and really prioritizing the support those states are giving for its war on Ukraine. I think it's fair to say on the flip side, Russia would point to US double standards in the non-proliferation regime, which we can get into as well during our discussion. And then finally, I think the third challenge we're facing are really specific proliferation concerns, of which Iran is, of course, at the top of that list. You know, the concern that Tehran itself could weaponize, but then also that it might cause this proliferation domino in the region. So we've seen Tehran make rapid advancements in its nuclear program since 2019, not just in terms of technical developments and stockpiling highly enriched uranium, but also making irreversible knowledge gains. And that part in particular, I think, is most concerning. This, of course, is exacerbated by its fraught cooperation with the IAEA, so the international monitoring system. And so essentially, Iran has really achieved what experts would call a threshold status. It has many of the components it would need to develop a nuclear weapon. It's just missing a political decision to do so. And amidst the ongoing conflict with Israel, there's more talk about making that political decision, potentially. You know, we've seen comments coming out of Tehran really characterizing nuclear weapons as imperatives for national security. And even short of that weaponization decision, we've also seen discourse around, you know, a different policy option of potentially withdrawing from the NPT. And full disclosure, a colleague and I recently wrote an article about this, so that's why I bring it up, but happy to, again, elaborate that on our discussion. But just to flag as well, you know, in addition to Iran obviously being first and foremost proliferation concern, I think from a US perspective and a UK perspective, we also need to be thinking about the possibility of allied proliferation. So I'm thinking about South Korea in particular, where we see growing mainstream discourse around, you know, nuclear weapons and the possibility of South Korea developing an independent program, fueled by the North Korean nuclear threat first and foremost, but also concerns about the credibility and sustainability of US extended deterrence. And there was a notable uptick in rhetoric, I think, last week following the US election. But of course, this has been a debate that has been going on for at least as long as the North Korean program has existed. And, you know, I'll flag as well, another caveat here is the South Korean proliferation concern is certainly not as pressing as the Iranian concern, not least because South Korea is completely adhering to its IAEA safeguards. You know, the official policy is still a full commitment to the NPT, and also because South Korea doesn't have all of the components it would actually need to proliferate as Iran increasingly does. But the prospect of South Korean proliferation, I think, will prompt a serious reckoning in Washington and other Western capitals about, you know, thinking about allied proliferation. It's not an issue we've had to deal with in decades. So that's a bit dreary, but let me go ahead and stop there.
Thank you, Jamie, and we can get into perhaps any options you see for policy responses later on. Patricia, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, you know, building on what Rose and Jamie said, I think where we are right now is probably the worst we've been for a long time because, you know, at the end of the Cold War, we had an opportunity to build trust between the United States and Russia, but also the UK and France and China and others. That was partly through the arms control process, the bilateral arms control process, partly through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, partly through negotiating the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, and so on. We built up a system of trust with checks and balances, verification measures, confidence building measures, and so on. It wasn't perfect, but it did what it needed to do in that it kept those channels open. It provided transparency. It meant that we understood each other better. We had better messaging. We understood the meaning of things. And it also gave us a much needed time for any military significant cheating. I mean, that's what the whole purpose of it was. And, you know, that's almost entirely gone. Bit by bit, it's been sort of whittled away, and we're now down to one bilateral treaty, and Rose rightly points out we've got some time. And I completely agree that what we've got to do now is prepare for opportunity. That's what luck is all about, preparation for opportunity, and we need a lot of luck. But we need to be ready should an opportunity arise. But we also, I think, need to reprioritize. So arms control and disarmed, non-proliferation, just are really, really important. We've got to keep on with those throughout the treaty structures that still exist. But we've also got to think about something else, and that is to prevent use, because I think we're in a very different environment now, and I would prioritize that more than anything else. And it's very hard to do. So we in prioritizing that these weapons should never be used again in conflict. How do we do that? We've lost our checks and balances. We've lost our relationships in which we can have these things easily. And even if we keep those relationships at the working level, at the diplomatic level, which is so vitally important, at the higher political level, it's extremely difficult, and it was probably made more difficult with the recent US election. So it also very dramatically affects nuclear deterrence postures. Nuclear deterrence postures, if they work entirely through the messaging being clear. And I think this lack of communication and lack of knowledge about each other's arsenals, etc., means that our messaging and our communication is very unclear and very muddied. And so we really need arms control as the other side of nuclear deterrence postures. It's absolutely vital. So how do we strengthen the taboo of use? And there have been attempts to do this. Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev made a joint statement about how nuclear war could never be won and should never be fought. And that has been reiterated by all 5 nuclear weapon states within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a good start. The trouble is, very soon after the last reiteration of this, President Putin was making nuclear weapons threats in the most unnecessary set of circumstances, right at the beginning, if you remember, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Days later, there were some threats coming out about, how the allowing the use at a lower level than the president would be enabled, and so on. So we very quickly went from 0 to 60, if you like, in nuclear weapons use rhetoric very early on in the war against Ukraine. And then, of course, later on that year, we had some evidence, it turns out, most of us didn't know this at the time, of mobilization and real worry. But here's my light in the dark. And that was the response of China to this. So when the fear was at its greatest, a number of countries that I understand include the United States and Germany talked with China, and China made a direct intervention with Russia, with President Putin. India also spoke up as well, which I think was very important, and said, do not use these weapons, right? Because to use nuclear weapons is very different. To actually explode nuclear weapons, to cross that threshold, could set off an enormous set of cascading consequences. We have at the moment an opportunity to look at that. In the UN in 1988, so towards the end of the Cold War, there was a study done on the long-term impacts of nuclear weapons. We have learnt so much since then. There's so much more scientific evidence about the long-term impacts of radiation, for example. It takes decades for all of that information to come through because of their very long term. So the hibakusha of Japan, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all the downwinders in nuclear test sites, indigenous peoples who've been subjected to nuclear radiation from atmospheric testing and so on. All of that data has been coming through in recent years. So this is new in terms of the impact. We also now have very new understanding of our climate, thanks to climate modeling, which, by the way, was originally developed for nuclear weapons modeling. So just, that irony. So the computer modeling for the climate, we now understand so much more about inter-hemispheric mixing and so on. So what we do know now is that the use of a much lower number of nuclear weapons in cities, where a lot of carbon would go into the atmosphere, could end up creating global famine and terrible growing conditions for about a decade. We need to do more research on this, but that research is very clear and I think very well accepted. But not everybody understands that. People today, because nuclear weapons haven't been in their consciousness for so long, confuse the accident at Chernobyl or the accident at Fukushima with nuclear weapons explosions, and they're nothing like each other at all. People don't understand the full-scale set of impacts. I'm sure that the scientists in the nuclear weapon states understand them, but people who have to make decisions, ordinary people, about their lives, don't understand it. So we have now a resolution that's just been adopted in the UN General Assembly, and it means that a new study will take place looking at the long-term impacts. It was a scientific study, and scientists will be appointed to it. And I think this will help people understand why it's so important to prevent their use and why it's so important to re-establish arms control, non-proliferation and disarmament measures.
Thank you very much. I think that gives us a good set of introductions. I'm about to open the floor for the Q&A, so please think of any questions that you might want to ask. But in the meantime, while you think about your questions, and I can see we've already had a lot of good questions come in online, I have 2 questions for each of you. So the first question is, given that we now know the outcome of the US election and we are going to go into a second Trump presidency in January 2025, is there anything that we can observe from the things that the first Trump administration did in the nuclear realm that can tell us something about what they might prioritize doing in 2025 or perhaps beyond, if you can foresee anything that might happen beyond 2025? And then secondly, I know some of you have already mentioned a few different policy options that we've got, but just because Jamie in particular was asking for an opportunity to spread a bit more cheer, I wanted to ask you all, what do you think we can do about the challenges that we face? Do you see any obvious solutions that perhaps aren't being taken? Are there any changes that we could make that would be fairly easy, which could reduce nuclear risks or which could bring parties back to the negotiating table? For example, I saw someone ask in the chat already about the AI agreement that we heard about today, where President Xi and President Biden agreed on not giving AI systems any control over nuclear weapons. Is this something that we could expand upon? Essentially, what kind of silver linings do you see? Why don't we go in orders of speakers? So I'll start with Rose again, and then Jamie and Patricia. And feel free to pick and choose from my questions what you want to answer. Rose, over to you.
Thank you very much. And yes, thank you for that great introduction, because I did want to make note of the Xi agreement with President Biden over the weekend. And so important, if you look at the White House statement, it talks about the 2 countries having basically agreed to sponsor each other's resolutions in the UN General Assembly. And I think on AI and AI constraints, and I think we're so discouraged these days about what's happening in the UN Security Council that to see a bright spot of this kind in the United States and China agreeing to work the AI problem together in the UN General Assembly, I think that this is a great step forward, first of all, but I think it also bespeaks an area where we all need to be paying more attention. We have long accustomed ourselves to controlling hardware, missiles, bombers, submarines, nuclear warheads, but we haven't really been able to do much so far about the emergence of new technologies that are software-based, not hardware-based, and there's going to be a huge challenge in ensuring that we are controlling these kinds of systems in some way, or at least building mutual confidence about their applications, because I think that they will have a profound implication for the stability of deterrence going forward. This too is an area that requires more study. So I just want to say, I think the Biden-Xi meeting over the weekend had a very solid, positive message to it about the resolve of these 2 countries, China and the United States, to try to get arms around the problem of how artificial intelligence and perhaps other new technologies will affect the stability of nuclear deterrence going forward. So let's hold that thought and see how we expand on it. It's a huge area for new study, and I think we're really going to have to spend some considerable time and intellectual capital figuring out what to do to get some mutual predictability in this arena. So that's the first comment I'd like to make. The second comment I would like to make is with regard to what to expect from President Trump in this second administration. The first time around, he had some big ambitions, like a nuclear agreement with the DPRK, and that basically stumbled over demands, I think, placed on Kim Jong-un that simply were not, he was not able to fulfill, perhaps too much of a heavy lift for him in his domestic setting. We won't go into that in too much detail today, but I do want to note that Trump, if there's anything we know about Trump, he likes to be the big deal maker, right? The big deal maker with a lot of attention on the world stage. He wants to be a big peacemaker. I think that's what's driving his urge to resolve the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, as he famously promised during his election campaign. I know there is some intention to try to get moving quickly on some kind of resolution. I don't know exactly what that means. But as I wrote in a piece, again, in the Financial Times last Friday, I think this is an opportunity for us to really make it clear that, you know, Putin can't have a negotiation that is a zero-sum game here. That's not something that Trump's going to stand for. You know, winner take all, Putin gets all, deals out a crushing defeat to Ukraine, to NATO, and the United States of America. Trump's not going to go for that. And so for that reason, there's going to have to be some balance of concessions. And one of the concessions that I've laid out would be for Putin to agree to come back to the negotiating table to talk about a future arms control deal and nuclear stability, as well as to restore the implementation of the New START treaty. Of course, this is my proposal. It has nothing to do with what the incoming Trump team or the Biden administration is thinking at the moment. But I do think we need to bear in mind that there can be an opportunity in the dynamics of this upcoming period and in the dynamics of an upcoming negotiation, which I believe will take shape over the war in Ukraine. So again, let's think about opportunities going forward and see if we can make lemonade out of lemons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jamie.
Yeah, so jumping off of Rose's points on the Trump administration, I think zooming out a little bit from specific issues, I think the most that we can expect is a lot of uncertainty, right? And that's partially because we're waiting to see who staffs up the nuclear file, right? We've seen a lot of high-level appointments at the cabinet and secretary level, but there's still a lot of open questions on who's going to serve in these key positions in DoD and state, what have you, on nuclear issues. And I think that plays a key role. Also, you know, to Rose's point, I think Trump as a whole, there's a lot of unpredictability that we saw in the first administration. I was going to point out North Korea as well in 2017, where you see the fire and fury remarks, versus 2018, you see Trump shaking hands with Kim at the Singapore summit. So I think unpredictability is probably something to expect. Whether we can leverage that as an opportunity, I hope we can. You know, I think in particular on the extended deterrence question, you know, being sat in the UK and the broader European context, I think there's some very legitimate concerns and questions from allies around Trump's continued commitment to it, given a lot of the comments around burden sharing, what played out in the first administration, on the election trail, what have you. I think we've seen some very important efforts in the Biden administration to kind of institutionalize some reassurance efforts, obviously reassurance being key to extended deterrence. If you think in the South Korea context, for example, standing up the NCG, the Nuclear Consultative Group. And so we'll see how that plays out in terms of, you know, does that help to provide some insulation in what might be a turbulent time? And then shifting to policy recommendations, I feel like maybe I overcharacterized it as being a little bit more optimistic than I probably am. But just to pick up on that AI statement as well, to flag one additional point, China is currently the chairman of the P5 process. And so, you know, is this an opportunity for China to characterize getting a win by bringing this type of statement to the P5 and, you know, being able to present at the upcoming RevCon or the PrepCom in April that the P5 collectively agree to a statement like this and can encourage one another on that. That feels like a good opportunity to me that can help address some of the challenges I drew out in the NPT, that first challenge, especially because, you know, there's a lot of calls for risk reduction measures, but the P5 arguably haven't been showing up, right? There haven't been very many tangible measures coming out of the P5 process in particular. On the non-proliferation consensus challenge as a whole, you know, I think it's generally hard to see a lot of room for progress as we continue to see Russia and increasingly China unwilling to compartmentalize the nuclear issue as we historically did during the Cold War. But to the extent in the US context that there's questions around kind of the Trump administration's policies and whether competition might be prioritized over some traditional policies like non-proliferation policies. I think there's a lot of work that civil society actors can do to make a lot of arguments and security arguments about the value of non-proliferation, and I'm hopeful that we'll kickstart a lot of that work. And then finally, just to touch briefly on the proliferation challenges, I think we need to do a lot of homework on how we can revisit and update our non-proliferation toolkit, thinking about how we need different tools to deter different types of proliferation, right? The US is not going to implement the same types of tools in an Iranian context as the South Korean context. And we also need to be creative about who's implementing these tools. In a lot of ways, because of that non-proliferation consensus challenge, maybe nuclear states aren't best fit for this as much anymore, and we need to really draw on non-traditional actors, if you will, to play a key role here. So maybe that's a little bit of hope.
Thank you, Patricia.
Yeah, that's a great last idea, and I'm thinking very much of the UK-Norwegian verification project, which has been replicated around the world, and building up that expertise in non-nuclear weapon states, but who have enough knowledge to be able to do it. I think that's a great idea. I think as well, exploring potential discussions with countries like China, India, and how they have, how China and India both have not only a policy of no use against non-nuclear weapon states and no first use against nuclear weapon states, but they also had, until recently, you might argue they still have, but it's fast changing, unfortunately, because of submarines, but they had a physical posture where they demated the warheads from the missiles. And so you actually could see this in real life. So what sort of confidence building measures could we look at like that? What sort of mechanisms could we develop? Have we left it too late for that? Quite possibly. It may not be 100% perfect, but we don't need perfection in everything. But we do need to ratchet down the tension and build that confidence. The problem that I have, I think, is, when we started discussions and negotiations with Gorbachev, and it was very exciting. There was the new end of the Cold War. There was the new administration in Russia. And then the confidence built. Now trust has been broken, and as everyone knows, in every relationship they've ever had, once you've broken trust with somebody, unless there's something you've fundamentally misunderstood and can recast your misunderstanding so that you can kind of make amends with each other, it's so hard to re-establish trust, because you can never fully trust each other again. And the idea of re-establishing trust is almost insurmountable. You will never fully trust them. So my view is, let's stop trying to worry about trust and almost go back to the pre-end of the Cold War, or the pre-Gorbachev years, to think how we, it was trust but verify was always Reagan's approach. And in a way, let's weatherproof, and let's learn from this experience and weatherproof any agreements we have going forward, so that they aren't just negotiated when times are good and people are getting on with each other, but that they're negotiated to withstand the stormy weather of really difficult politics. And that brings me then to, funnily enough, President Trump. I think he might well be much more emboldened this time. A, he has a much greater mandate in terms of from the people of the United States. B, it's his second term. He's been around the block once. He's been thinking about it in that gap, in those the gap years of President Biden. For him, that's how he'll think about it. He's been thinking about what he would have done, what he could have done differently, what he might do next. One of the things that, if we look at what's happened with Iran since October the 7th last year, Iran has put itself into a really difficult position in the Middle East, where its proxies that it's been supporting, Hamas and Hezbollah, have been routed by Israel. But it's going to be much harder, I think, to engage Iran. And President Trump never really wanted to. President Trump wanted to kind of beat them into a different position. So what will happen there, we don't know. And the other, of course, is this completely not understood relationship between President Trump and President Putin. We do not know what that relationship is. They had a meeting when President Trump was in office as president, which there were no notes, nothing. We still don't know what was in that meeting. And apparently they have been talking ever since. So what is this relationship? Is it something that in fact Trump will build on and make something out of that will perhaps, lead to the end of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? What that would look like, we don't know. Or is it something else? And I think that this is one of my big concerns about going forward, that it's very hard for us to understand what the parameters of that relationship might be.
Thank you very much. Okay, now it's over to all of you to ask whichever questions you might have. I'm just waiting to see where we've got the microphones. I've already seen a few hands. So we've got one hand in the middle here, second row from the front, in a beige jumper.
Thank you. Thomas Apostolou. I'm an undergraduate international relations student at the School of Oriental and African Studies. I had the privilege of representing Cyprus at the UN Disarmament Conference in Geneva this summer, which Dr. Mesmer was actually at, representing Chatham House at a side event. This was my first UN experience, and I have to say that it was an MPT prep con. It was nothing short of a shouting match between the nuclear weapon holding states. And I just wanted to ask the panel if they believe that the UN is still the relevant organization to be discussing disarmament and non-proliferation issues, and whether they can see any successes coming down the line for the MPT, especially considering that it's so closely tied to the UN, which is in the middle of this liquidity crisis, which is genuinely crippling the ability of diplomats to actually do effective diplomacy in New York and Geneva and Vienna and other places. So yes, my question is just pertaining to how the UN can better foster fruitful dialogue surrounding the MPT and disarmament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take 3 questions. So we had another one, third row from the front on your left. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. Excuse me. Thanks so much for speaking with us. My name is Kyle Tucker, and I'm a master's student at King's College London doing security studies. Dr. Lewis, I was interested, you brought up the UN General Assembly resolution on the effects of nuclear war, and something that I noticed that was quite fascinating was how the P5 members voted on that resolution. Russia, France, and the UK voted against setting up this study, while the US and China abstained. I was curious if you or others would like to comment on maybe the logic of the P5 members there, especially the UK and France, on their decision to vote solidly against it.
Thank you. And then we had a final question in the very front. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Hussein Murad. I'm doing European politics at King's College London. And I was wondering, how does the inexperience of individuals such as Peter Hegseth and the ultra-nationalist sentiments of individuals such as Shoigu Gerasimov in Russia impact the implementation of non-proliferation treaties generally?
Thank you very much. Great. So we've got 3 great questions. Shall we go in opposite order this kind of time, starting with Patricia? Sorry about that. I will basically switch back and forth so you can mentally prepare yourself that you'll be... It will be your turn as well, Jamie. Don't worry. I'll mix it up so that everyone goes first. But yeah, Patricia, why don't you start and just pick whichever questions you'd want to answer.
Thank you. So is the UN still the right place? Yes, of course. The UN is the member states, and then there's a secretariat. So the secretariat does a very good job at, servicing all of the big treaty negotiations, the meetings, the preparatory committees, et cetera, et cetera. And then the member states do a terrible job of agreeing. But they're the member states, right? They're sovereign governments, and that's their job. They know what they're doing. So it's not the UN as such that's the problem, it's the member states, right, who are not finding agreement. There are some structures in the UN that I would change, though, and I would certainly change the Conference on Disarmament, because we've bound ourselves into a consensus. I mean, I used to joke when I was there that, practically needed consensus to us to go to the bathroom. And it's got ridiculous. You can't even sort of repeat your agenda from last year. You have to go through all these shenanigans all the time. And it hasn't actually achieved anything since the negotiation of the nuclear test ban in 1996. And even that hasn't been fully entered into force yet. So that's the kind of thing. I'm a great believer in achieving consensus via the threat of a vote. Yeah. When you know you've got to get consensus, then you can veto if you wish, right? Whereas if you know you're going to be vote and be exposed, then you might find consensus. And we've seen that time and time again. We certainly see it in the UN General Assembly, which brings me to UN General Assembly resolution. So yeah, it was very strange. And by the way, there's still another chance for this vote because that was in the first committee of the UN General Assembly, which is the Security Committee. And there's an actual vote that's coming up of the resolution in the actual General Assembly. So there's an opportunity to fix this. For me, France and the UK voting with Russia, which they did last year on another resolution as well, which is all about the cleanup of nuclear testing and the impact on indigenous peoples and so on. I think it's a really bad look. It's a bad look for France and the UK. And it was an opportunity to, if you like, let Russia stand by itself on this. I can't see what's wrong in a scientific study to look at the impact of nuclear weapons. I think people need to know that. I think it's educational. It allows better decisions. If you're a pro-deterrence, nuclear deterrence person, we're all pro-deterrence, of course, but if you think nuclear weapons deter, then it would strengthen your case. So I don't see the problem there. It's a very odd thing, and I think that the US and China's decision to abstain was much better. And the US, in fact, I think, I understood they made it quite clear to NATO allies that it was fine for people to vote in favor of the resolution or abstain if they wished or whatever. They weren't like putting any pressure on. So it was a very odd decision, and I think people were really disappointed in the UK particularly. Because of course it's a new government, they thought maybe this would be a fresh start. So goodness knows what the real reason behind it is. But I think there may be a misunderstanding somewhere at the heart of it, and I would love the chance to explore further with those making the decision about how we could maybe modify that a bit. Thanks.
Thank you. Jamie.
Great. So I think I'll leave the P5 vote there. I think that was a great response. On the first question, let me dive specifically into the NPT space, which of course sits within the broader UN construct, as Patricia outlined in terms of treaties. I think it's an irreplaceable place, right? Not only is the NPT nearly universal, but because of that, it means that all states have a voice. And of course, there's an imbalance, right? You see a lot of coverage and weight and attention given to the P5 and in particular their allies as well. But I think we absolutely need to preserve that space because it does give an opportunity for all member states to have a voice. And there's ways to strengthen their voice through regional coalitions or coalitions built out of mutual interests, what have you. But I think that's absolutely something we need to work towards, right? And a lot of us on the stage have been involved in a lot of the NPT civil society efforts to try to work towards that. And then finally on the question around individuals' impacts, I think in terms of thinking about non-proliferation treaties and the regime as a whole, I think there is some resilience built into the architecture. Again, as I said, the NPT is nearly universal, which is a good thing. There's a lot of other follow-on things that come out of that. So there is some resilience there. That said, I think on a positive side of things, we can see the positive impact that individuals can have, and I might, put our chair on the spot here, but I think in particular, we've seen historically some individuals really being the key drivers behind arms control agreements. Marion did a whole PhD on this. Rose was a US negotiator on New START and really drove the process. I think that kind of exemplifies how individuals can play a very positive and impactful role. So there's my optimism for you.
Thank you, Jamie. Rose, over to you.
Read Rose's book, I would say.
Yes,
absolutely.
definitely.
Yeah.
I'm really happy for all of you to plug your various articles. We already heard about Rose's FT articles. Jamie, of course, just wrote something as well. And then there's Rose's amazing book on negotiating the New START. So if you haven't read that yet, you definitely should. But Rose, what did you think about the questions?
Well, thank you. All very good questions. And I wanted to foot stomp Patricia's response about the value of stepping away from consensus sometimes and moving to at least the threat of a vote. It does wondrous things for getting countries to step out from behind where they're hiding. They might be hiding behind another country because they absolutely have to stand and express their opinion in one way or another. I've also seen, and people will argue with this, but in recent years, in another major organization supporting an international regime, the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, has stepped away from consensus decision making toward voting in certain circumstances. And I think it has been highly valuable. I know that some countries would argue with that, but I think it has been highly valuable. So that is really what I wanted to say. On the notion of the one question about individuals seem to be focused on people like Shoigu and Gerasimov, who are serving obviously in the military policymaking arena of an autocratic state now, the Russian Federation. You know, we know from history that whenever the leader decides to move in a certain direction, everyone stands and salutes. So I don't worry so much about their, I would say, braking function. It's up to Putin to decide when he wants to return to the nuclear negotiating table. And he's the most influential, I would say, character in that particular political setting. And so people ask all the time, is the system going to prevent it? Well, I think in the case of those kinds of regimes, it's the individual leader who can prevent it. But once that individual changes his mind, then away we go. We're back in business again, for good or for ill.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, I selected 3 questions from our online audience. Jamie, this time I'll start with you. I'll give you the warning ahead of time, just so that it's fair on Rose and Patricia. So the first question is, should there be greater population resilience for nuclear war, given all of the threats we've been talking about and the rising risks? The second question is, what has happened to no first use policies? So I think this person asked that question in the context of it being a talking point during the Biden presidential campaign, but I think can also be broadened out for any opportunities on this from the P5, perhaps in connection with Patricia's point on statements that leaders could make. And then finally, how can we bring non-NPT nuclear armed states into dialogue or arms control agreements? So I think we have a lot there to get into. Jamie, let's start with you, and feel free to pick whichever questions you want to pick up.
Perfect. Yeah. So let me draw on that no first use policies questions first and foremost. So I think you're referring to kind of the Biden administration. As Vice President Biden was leaving office, he actually gave a speech at the Carnegie Endowment long before my time, where he was talking about sole purpose. So this concept of potentially changing U.S. nuclear posture, so that there was a clear statement that nuclear weapons would only be used in nuclear conflicts. And a lot of people were hopeful that when Vice President Biden became President Biden, that he would adopt this posture. He didn't. In the end, there was a lot of consistency across administrations, as we've seen U.S. NPRs released, nuclear posture reviews released. The specific no first use policy is slightly different than a sole purpose. No first use is as it sounds, right? That a state declares not to use nuclear weapons first. China currently maintains a no first use policy. I believe India and Pakistan? India, okay, have their no first use policies. I think, a lot of folks in Washington, probably in London as well, question the credibility of China's no first use policy in particular as we're seeing this expansion effort, as Rose kind of outlined in her remarks. But I think what we can draw on here and where there is a potential opportunity, again, I mentioned that China is currently chairing the P5 process. Within that forum, it has put forward a proposal to discuss a no first use treaty among the P5. A lot of people think that might be a non-starter, in particular in Washington, but I think that could be a starter for dialogue, an opportunity to help actually dive into some of the misunderstandings that we've been outlining on this stage tonight and really use it as an opportunity to better understand, why does China think we all need a no first use policy? What are the risks that they see in US policy? And kind of dive into the particulars. And maybe that's an in-ramp, if you will, to get towards that. On involving non-NPT nuclear states in arms control and some of these discussions, that's a real challenge, right? And I think it's something that, we've been struggling with for quite some time. Let me focus particularly on North Korea, which is a unique state in this sense for having been a member of the NPT and then having withdrawn and developed a nuclear program. Because of that history, the US in particular and South Korea have a policy of, working towards denuclearization, right? They want North Korea to disarm. They don't recognize North Korea as a nuclear armed state because they violated the NPT. There's some legalities within that. But I think there's a question now, given kind of the real world that we're living in 2024, with the size of North Korea's arsenal, its growing and advanced delivery capabilities, is North Korea really a proliferation problem anymore, or is it really a risk reduction issue that we have to deal with? And I sit a little bit more in the latter camp, that we need to shake up the status quo approach. Pyongyang is never going to come to a negotiation table where denuclearization is at the top of the list. Surely it would be more impactful to work from a very base mutual interest in avoiding nuclear war. And what are the measures and steps that we can take to do that? So maybe a broader response to this question would be taking an effort to meet some states where they are in order to make progress.
Thank you very much. Patricia, what do you think?
So in terms of the no-use policies and sole purpose, I think that we need to sort of step back from behind that to see what the purpose of those are. And for me, it's about, it's a measure to try to build confidence and to message that they're not a threat. That's the idea, we have these weapons. So, I wanted to just for a minute as well recognize how much brilliant work has been done since the end of the Cold War. At the height of the Cold War in the mid-1980s, which was such a dangerous time when we had a number of near misses of nuclear weapons, which we haven't gone into in this discussion, but you can read it in various Chatham House publications, where we have a joke in the non-proliferation disarm nuclear deterrence community that there's more evidence for God than there is for nuclear deterrence, right? And the hand of God seems to have applied on a number of occasions. I'm not talking about a footballer. So it's a really it was really dangerous. These are really dangerous weapons. They're in a class of their own. They're not like conventional weapons. They're nothing like it. And we've gone from 60,000 weapons in the 1980s to 10,000 today, worldwide. So that's 5,000 each, really, in US and Russia, and the rest are sort of loose change. So China's at 500 at the moment is the best estimate, growing, but nonetheless a tenth. And the UK's 225, France around 290, and then as you go down, much fewer weapons. So let's just understand the problem here. It's really a bilateral treaty, and thanks to people like Rose and her team, we've really brought those numbers down. So it can be done, and it can be done again, but it's going to be much harder second time around, I think, in part because of what's going on now. So no-use policies, no first-use policies are declaratory. You can do things to reinforce your postures, like I said, by demating warheads and so on. But you can also do other things. You can begin discussions to, again, communicate that you want partnership rather than threat. So, China's always said, we won't join arms control negotiations until we're at the same level. So I think everyone always thought, the US and Russia would bring theirs down and then there'd be about, 300 each, and then China. Well, it looks like China's going the other way to meet them, which would be such pity. And I think that there's better ways for China to think about this, in terms of stabilization, in terms of building good relationships and communicating intent, because that's really important in this. That's something that China could do, and that's join in negotiations with the United States and others. I think as well, India and Pakistan, as two countries that are nuclear armed but outside the NPT, have had bilateral treaties in the past which have worked well. They have set up a set of confidence building measures which, did work for a while and then didn't fail. They were called the cricket CBMs, when they were going to each other's cricket matches and so on. And I think that, there's real opportunity there. There's no interest for either of those two countries in having a nuclear war, right? It would be disastrous. So, there should be some real interest there in developing a different discussion that should be between them. India always looks to China, of course, which makes it difficult. But if China were perhaps in a different bilateral set of discussions as well, that might help. Because, when I talked about the UN, one of the things I forgot to mention was that it's not just about multilateral, it's also about bilateral. These things are not either or, they're both, and they're both really important. And bilateral isn't just the US and Russia, it could be a number of other bilaterals too. So I'll leave it there. And I realize that none of us is answering the first question.
Rose, how about you? Which is not to say you have to answer the first question, but if you wanted to, that would be okay.
Please give me a brief reminder of the first question.
So the first question was, should there be greater population resilience for nuclear war, given all the risks that we face at the moment?
Yes, I did want to state that I just noted this morning in reading my news feed from NATO that, in fact, Finland and Sweden are upping their guidance to their populations about preparations for war as a whole, and not just nuclear war. I don't advise a return to the kind of steps we had with, civil defense exercises, and God knows, Patricia will remember hiding under desks and so forth as children back in the 60s. I don't advocate returning to nuclear war specific resilience measures, but I do think it's useful to have awareness of civil defense and implications for populations of war and aggression breaking out. And I think in the NATO alliance anyway, Sweden and Finland have taken the lead in highlighting these measures and essentially conveying them to their own populations. And I think that's a remarkable leadership role they've already assumed in the NATO alliance, which I welcome very much. I did want to pile on a bit on no first use, and it's because this is an opportunity, speaking to an audience in the UK with many from the rest of Europe presence. I hope that if the P5 gets into a discussion about no first use, I agree with Jamie 100%. This is an opportunity to find out what the heck China is up to. If they are going to talk about their plans and their programs in the context of how it is going to support a no first use pledge, because it looks at the moment like what they're doing is actually contradicting no first use. Patricia made this point earlier. So if this is an opportunity to get them to try to explain that conundrum, let's take it and let's not panic. I was frankly very perturbed in the previous period when the sole purpose proposal that President Biden was proposing kind of got into European capitals and caused a general panic also among US Asian allies. So let's take this as an opportunity to talk to China, to figure out what their goals and objectives are. And oh, by the way, in the end of the day, I think that a no first use pledge among the P5 would be really no different than the kind of pledge we make on detargeting. It's a confidence building and predictability measure. It's declaratory policy. Just as Patricia said, it's no first use in peacetime. When wartime comes, of course, we'll address our national security interests and those of our allies, as we must, no matter what our declaratory policy is. So I'm only just pleading that if we can have a discussion on this with China and in the P5, I think it could be highly valuable.
Thank you very much. We've got a few minutes left only, so let's perhaps take one last question from the audience, and let's do a very quick fire round. We've got someone in the first row here on your right-hand side. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Helen Blanc. I simple membership of Chatham House, and I could say I political expert in retirement now. My question is, you rightly say the nuclear rhetoric is men's rhetoric, but today here, mostly women have a deal with solving pretended nuclear threats. And from my point of view, it's very symbolic. That's why my questions to you, Prisha. What is your opinion? Today, there are many central of influence that try to talk and discuss about peace, about remove tension, reduction the nuclear threats, etc. But obviously that they not achieve in this purpose. Question is, what do you think? Should appear the new center of influence, and what is parameter of this center of influencer who can take responsibility for negotiation and make reduction these nuclear threats, make reduction this global tension. What is the parameter, how this center should declaration, manifestation in new environment and in the globe? It's my question.
Could you try stating your question a little shorter and maybe a little more loudly? It's a little hard to hear you on the stage. I'm really sorry.
It's very hard. I'm not fully understanding what you're asking.
Today, how solving this problem with threats, global threats? That's now obviously because there are many national and global central who try to do it, but without successfully. What do you think? Should be the new central of impact? Because we are talking about new balances in the new environment and new global world. It's simple.
So essentially, how could we bring new voices into solving this problem?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
great.
About new voices and how its voices should sound.
Great. Thank you very much for that question. I think that's a nice one to end on. It was asked directly to Patricia, but I think it's also something that Jamie and Rose might want to answer. So why don't we go Patricia, Jamie, Rose, and if you want to fold any closing thoughts into that, then please do so.
I mean, you know, this is something that I've been grappling with my whole career, but these new voices, you know, every generation, every new era needs these new voices. We have knowledge from the past that we can pass on, but one of the things that I think we really need to do is challenge the very notion that nuclear weapons deter. So that's very controversial, but I think it's really important to challenge. And the reason I say that is because if you think about what the devastating impact of nuclear weapons are, who would use them in the types of conflicts that we're seeing? The sorts of leaders who care, the governments who care about their citizens, would never want to risk the use of nuclear weapons, right? So governments that care about human rights, governments that care about healthcare for their population, they will never want to risk this. Governments who don't give a damn about their citizens or anyone else's citizens, they'll threaten all they like, right? And who knows, they might even decide to use them, even though it might end up in their own destruction. Because, you know, we've seen some really crazy decisions come from some of these leaders, which is what's making us also very worried now. Because, you know, you might say, well, they'd never do that because it would be suicide for them. But you know what? They have been doing some very near suicidal actions themselves, invading other countries, for example, against all international law, using chemical weapons on the soil of other countries. I could go on, assassination programs. I mean, there's really riding roughshod over all international law. And whereas all the countries that are upholding international law would never dream of using them. And so I do think that this challenge needs to be had, and it needs to be made, and it needs to be discussed without just going back in time. It needs to be discussed for the future, because I think it's a very different future from the past. I don't know if that helps you.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, I'll just quickly build on that. You know, I completely agree. I think we're facing new paradigms, new challenges, and because of that, we need to be open to new solutions and a new willingness to work the problem in different ways and be creative about that. And I think there's a lot of benefit in the nuclear space for folks like Patricia and Rose and Marion to welcome new voices into the space to try to think differently about these really hard issues.
Thanks, Jamie. Rose, any final comments from you?
Yes, it's really been a pleasure to appear with all of you, and I take note of our questioner's remark that this is an all-woman panel. I do think, first of all, and I've long thought that there is a special role for women in negotiations of all kinds. We know from a lot of research that peace negotiations that have women involved have a tendency to stick longer because women are so oftentimes the link back to the grassroots, to, well, we could say home and hearth. That's a bit of a cliche, but they also are very well tied into their communities oftentimes, and so they can deliver for all stakeholders. So I would like to end on that positive note by also saying that I have really value the opportunity to work for all these years with Patricia Lewis. I know this is not a farewell for her, but I know this is probably the last time I'll be in a venue where we are speaking together. So just a big thank you to Patricia Lewis for all the work that she has done over the years to ensure that all voices are heard. So thank you for that. And Marian, back over to you.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful note to close on. Thank you to all of you in the audience, both here at Chatham House and online. Thanks so much for joining us. And please join me in thanking our speakers for their excellent remarks.